Well, first of all, just having a social movement is a way that people can transform despair and fear into a sense of hope.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of Eteron, Institute for Research in Social Change, we would like to welcome you all to the online discussion. We're very glad to have with us today Professor James Jasper. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And we will discuss about emotions, politics, and social movements. I am Kώστας Γούσης, coordinator of the project Youth Voice On, and I'm here with Lουκία Κοτρωνάκη, lecturer and postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science and History of Padua University. So, Lουκία, please introduce our great guest.
Thank you very much for attending this meeting and for the occasion to have this great conversation. Let me say some words for James Jasper. James Jasper is a sociologist. Since 1987, he has taught at different departments of the United States universities, and he has made a major contribution to social movements theory by initiating the cultural approach in the study of collective action in social movements. He has written a number of books and articles on recent social movements, and he is author of the classical book, The Art of Moral Protest, and the reference article, Emotion in Social Movements, 20 Years of Theory and Research. He is co-editor of Amsterdam University Press's book series, Protest and Social Movements, while his latest book, Gains and Losses, has published last year by Oxford University Press. James, we would like to welcome you, and we are very grateful for this conversation.
Well, it's very good to be with you. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. Well, many social scientists and social movement scholars often tend to ignore emotions as an analytic dimension. In contrast, your broader work has significantly contributed to a theory of action focusing on emotional dynamics. Or, as you put it in your book, The Emotions of Protest, brains can feel and hearts can think. So, what can we learn about politics and protest when we move emotions to center stage?
Great. That's a big question. Let me try to summarize it by saying, if you want a theory of action as opposed to a theory of structure and constraint, which a lot of social movement theories are, if you care about action, you have to have emotions in there. Emotions are what give our action direction. They give it energy, or they take energy away. They guide us through life in a way, through different streams of action. So it's impossible to imagine really a theory of action that's not driven by emotions. The simple interest-driven notions of rational choice theory, for example, really have no way of explaining why we want what we want, why we have alliances with the people we do, why we choose certain tactics rather than others. All of these things are emotional processes. So we feel our way through life, through action, I think. And so as you break down action into its fundamental parts, either at the level of the individual ultimately, or at the level of interactions with others, those are emotions driving it. And the more specific we can be about those emotions, the better we will understand social action. So But what you're always trying to do in a social explanation is to break it down into the most fundamental parts, so that if I say, I did this because I was jealous, everybody accepts that. People understand what jealousy is or what indignation is. When you say, I was angry, I was indignant, people say, oh yes, that's a satisfactory explanation. We don't have to push any deeper to understand that action. So I think that's why emotions ultimately are the main building blocks of a theory of action, and political action, but all sorts of other kinds of action too. It's not restricted to politics, I would say.
One of the most prominent concepts you have introduced for explaining the outburst of collective action in the absence of organizational embeddedness is moral shock. Could you please define moral shock, its main features and factions in the field of contentious politics? And can you please tell us if all moral shocks operate in the same way, independently of the political environment or the conjuncture they appear?
So a moral shock, in my view, is when something happens that gets our attention and makes us to realize the world is different from how it had seemed to us. It requires some rebuilding, some of our feelings or of our thinking about the world to make things right again. It's a puzzle. It's a challenge to who we are and how we view the world. So shocks can be paralyzing. Excuse me. They may not lead to action at all. They can lead to depression or resignation. But under certain circumstances, they can also motivate action. Now, those circumstances are often the standard factors of mobilization. Are there networks of people we know? Are there organizations at work? Are there resources available? Are there things for us to do? That's a standard way people get mobilized. But even in the absence of those, shocks can be so mobilizing, can be so activating that people will go, they will find networks that they are not yet part of, and they will join them. They will seek out organizations. Sometimes they will even start their own organizations, although that's an extreme case. So shocks can motivate action. But I think what has happened, I originally came up with the idea to explain why people join a movement even when they don't know anybody in the movement, even when they're not part of networks. However, what has happened over time, people have found moral shocks among people who are already in a movement or sympathetic to a movement, and their moral shock consists of re-energizing them, pushing them to participate more. So they don't change their point of view. Very few people ever change their point of view. So, but the moral shock sort of reminds them why they have been active, why they believe in human rights or policing work or whatever they have been active in, and it makes them want to do more. Brings them back into fuller activity because of the energizing part of the shock. So that's how the term has been used. The concept has been used more recently, I think, is sort of keeping a movement going in the face of adverse events that are shocking.
And we know that there is a negative correlation between low expectations and positive motivation to participate in collective action. Different forms of collective action, conventional and non-conventional as well. According to the findings of our research, Generation Z seems to be a generation of low expectations, without any real ambition of future social change. Nevertheless, this pessimism is not translated into a reluctant attitude towards the electoral process. How this paradox can be decoded? What patterns of love and hate and of relevant social activity are likely to be forged in low expectations, cognitive and emotional regimes.
Sorry for the interruption. So I can speak from the U.S. experience, where I think there was a lot of cynicism about electoral politics among activists on the left. There was a lot of cynicism about social change. After all, we lived through George W. Bush, and then Trump came along. There's Obama raised a lot of hopes that were then disappointed, that were dashed. I think that explains the Occupy Wall Street movement. So there are a lot of reasons to be sort of cynical and to have low expectations about protest and politics in general. But then one thing that happened here was when Trump was elected, these people who were fairly cynical about electoral politics realized, oh my God, things can get worse. Elections really do matter. And so there was a sort of surge of interest, I think, in mundane activities like voting, so that even though the hopes were not high for positive social change, the fears of threats of deterioration under a far right and crazy president were enough to motivate people at least to vote. So you have different sets of motivations in different arenas, perhaps. So you might have a different set of hopes and outrage in electoral politics than you do in social movements and protest politics. One may seem low cost, but in fact a useful way to act in electoral politics. At least that's my sense. It's very easy also to be cynical about electoral politics, but then things like Donald Trump happen.
But continue with elections a bit. In many recent elections, not only the US. For example, we had the Greek parliamentary elections very recently, and we're seeing both the right wing and the extreme right wing on the rise. Trying to explain this reactionary development, many analysts are stressing the irrationality of voters and the triumph of emotions over reason. However, you have argued in the past that in your work that we should move beyond these sterile debates over the rationality of voters and understand that the distinction between beliefs and emotions is wrong-headed. So if this is the case, then I would like to ask you, what is the thinking package behind the rise of the extreme right wing?
Sure. Well, there are what I call affective commitments or affective loyalties, which are emotions that are long-standing, that really guide our goals in life, our affiliations, so that we react to things on the basis of those background emotions. So a certain kind of love of country or love of a certain group, certain kind of group identity could be a very long-standing emotional loyalty that shapes what we do. So in the case of the right, let me speak about the U.S. right because I know more about it, but I think there are parallels in a lot of other countries. So clearly one of the key elements is a suspicion of immigrants, a dislike of foreigners, a kind of nationalism that is suspicious of anything that goes on outside the borders of your country, and especially of people coming into your newcomers into the country. That is every bit as much cognitive as emotional. In fact, it's a fusion of the two. I personally think that that's a wrong, both morally and intellectually wrong view of the world and how the world works and what benefits the country. But I think that the cognitive elements of that are as wrong as the emotional elements. It's hard to say it's irrational. I think it's wrong, but that's not the same as irrational. I just disagree with those points of view, but that doesn't mean they are any more emotional than my commitment to tolerance and diversity and freedom and so on. So I think that's part of the issue. In the U.S., there's an additional element that's, I think, a bit unusual, which is we have a very small, well, it's not small enough, quarter of the electorate, a quarter of the population, maybe in some measurements a third, are fundamentalist Protestants who believe that the Bible is literally the Word of God. And so they have a set of beliefs, and right now we're seeing it in mobilization against LGBT people, and trans people especially right now are targeted. And the reason is there are Christian fundamentalist preachers who are going around and sort of setting the agenda for the Republican Party when it comes to what used to be called family values and is now just a concern that somehow gay people are against God, are sinning in some ways. Now, to me, any belief, any faith like that borders on the irrational. But again, it's hard, that's just partly because it's so alien to my atheist way of viewing the world that it's hard for me to believe that it's rational. But it's certainly well padded with both symbols, cognitive claims, as well as longstanding emotional loyalties. So that's an element that I think it's unusually strong in the U.S. and especially in certain parts of the U.S. But it's not absent in other countries as well, this belief in some sort of religious guiding precepts. So again, the people on the right or on the left who seem way outside the mainstream have their worldviews that are very well developed, are quite sophisticated in their own way. They're full of facts. The anti-vaccination people in the U.S. have evidence and facts, that what they claim to be facts that look like science. They usually turn out not to really be science, but they are quantitative. They have numbers. They cite studies. They just are studies that have not followed the normal path of science, which involves some consensus and persuasion among scientists. But to them, they look like science. So these are positions that are well defended, let's say, and it's not just they're not just emotional positions, but intellectual positions.
Very structured reasoning. Yeah. And you argue that in your work that building confidence is crucial to all strategic action, and that this is important because activists often burn out and suffer from frustration, fatigue, and the negative effects of exposure to police repression. Are there any specific social movements, mechanisms, or interactions that can trigger processes of fear transformation into hope and to diffuse the defeatism into contentious confidence?
Yep. Well, first of all, just having a social movement is a way that people can transform despair and fear into a sense of hope. The fact that there are people out there doing something, acting, protesting against government policies, give some hope. And then you can join those movements, and action sort of feeds itself. You go out one day to a protest and you're not attacked by the police or shot at by the police. That gives you a sense, well, I can go out again and it's safer than I realized. Or it makes you think, well, these people whom I've seen protesting for years, they actually turn out to be very decent human beings whom I like and feel comfortable with. You join them and it makes you feel good. So there are positive feedback, the positive experiences of participating in a movement that then feed on themselves. Repression is a very real thing. Sometimes those fears are very real, and the police do shoot protesters and lock them up. Even then, repression can, from the point of view of the government, repression can backfire. And even more people will come into the street because they are indignant, they're outraged by the arbitrary police, army repression. And so this can feed on itself in a way. So confidence is important because it's confidence not just that you can win in the end, but also some confidence that you won't be harmed in acting and speaking out. But also there's a confidence that just comes from being able to voice your opinions and being part of a group that feels the same way that you do. That gives you confidence, that kind of collective identity. So movements do all these things, whether it's inspiring leaders, whether it's, excuse me, in some cases it's buying guns to protect themselves, arming themselves, gives them some confidence, and so on. There are all sorts of things that movements do.
Well, things are always contradictory in politicization processes. So I would like to ask you one last question about the relation between scholars, and specifically social movement scholars and activists, because there is sometimes there's a new wave of activism, even right now, for example, in the US union activism with new unions where the youth play an important role, like Starbucks or Amazon, etc. But these processes are discussed within social movement studies, but there are no real bridges between action and academic theorization. So how can we build a more productive relation between academia and real happening activism?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things. First, I think most social movement scholars in Europe and the US do have political activities as well. Most of them at least have been involved in social movements. Most of them continue to advise or do research for social movement groups. So I think there is an alliance maybe between academics and activists. But in the end, academics don't give very good strategic advice to activists. Because the activists are there moment to moment on the ground, and if they're good, they have a much better sense of the right tactical moment, the right time to, the right alliances than academics do, who have a certain distance. And, it's good to have a certain distance because you are trying to draw broader lessons that will be useful in other movements and other times and places as an academic. So in the end, the pragmatic understanding of the activists is not quite the same as the more abstracted theories, explanations of academics. You do want to continue talking to each other. And, in the US, most social movement scholars want to have that kind of dialogue, put on lots of conferences that include both activists and academics, but there are limits to that. Academics write in a way that most activists are not going to want to read. No normal people will really want to read our jargon and our data collection and analysis and all the things we do as professional social scientists. So we write for different audiences in a way, typically, and it's hard. But I think most social movement scholars try to write for both. They try to write for academic audiences, for their peers, other scholars, and they try to write other things in a more comprehensible, clearer, simpler way. Maybe simple is not quite the right word, but academics try to write well. They just don't always know how to do it.
Great. So, Lucia, do you have any last remark or question?
Many questions and yes, and incentives to continue the conversation. But I think that it's okay for a moment, and I hope that we have the opportunity to update our conversation. In the very close future, I hope so, because it is also,
I would like to.
Yes, a very, very refreshing view, very refreshing approaches, and even if there is a distance, there is a geographical distance, political and social phenomena and emotional questions are very similar and very, very, very similar. Yes.
Which suggests that with emotions, we are getting down to some very basic human processes that you can find across political arenas, across cultures. Cultures differ and emotions differ somewhat across cultures, but there is also a way in which you're always going to find emotions. And, anger may be a little different in one context or another. Culture especially affects how we display emotions quite differently in different places. But the emotions are still there, and often, very often, basically the same emotions. So it's very promising, I hope.
Yes, it is.
It was an important contribution because our research project on the youth in Greece began with a tragic event, actually, a train accident, the deadliest accident ever recorded in Greece. So we tried to follow the mobilizations after the train accident and the youth participation in these mobilizations. Lucia has prepared a research report based on a quantitative survey that was conducted by Eteron, and we were very much inspired by your work. We used the concept of moral shock. We tried to understand the role of emotions in the youth mobilizations, and this is a discussion, a dialogue that we continue now after the elections. We try to follow and reflect on the youth vote in the elections and generally the role that the emotions play in political and collective action. So this is why we were so happy to discuss with you, and you significantly contribute to our efforts, and we're looking forward to future cooperation.